Hope you are benefited with the previous session. We'll continue to the third session, Open Source Intelligence, or OSINT, in fact-checking and verification. Our resource person for this session is specializing in the verification of online content and information with more than 2 decades of experience in print, broadcast, and online media. He spent 6 years with groundbreaking social media news agency Storyful, where he was part of a core team that developed industry-leading techniques, systems, and practices in monitoring, discovery, and verification of online content. He followed this with a year and a half and global training director with First Draft, where he created and delivered training workshops for the not-for-profit organization, as well as in cooperation with Google News Initiative, Facebook Journalism Project, and others. He provides training and education in this field, as well as digital security to media outlets, activists, NGO staff, and others, and created and maintains OSINT Essentials, a website dedicated to introducing important tools, services, and concepts in online investigative work. Let me invite Organ Sweeney, independent consultant and trainer, to handle this session. Most welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. I was muted for a moment. Thank you for that introduction, Rishma. That was very kind of you. Can I just confirm my sound is okay?
Yes, sir, sure.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's great, always great to get this opportunity to speak to journalists in India. As Sunil and others will know, it's been an incredible experience for me to work with people in that part of the world. And I can frankly say it's been life-changing. And I think what we have achieved has been groundbreaking also. I was often told that there was it's a very dynamic media environment, India, and some people described it to me as having a lot of rivalry. And one of my friends there described it as more open hostility than rivalry. But I'm amazed by the levels of cooperation and collaboration that have gone on. So it's always great to be able to talk and address people in that part of the world. So it looks like a really interesting seminar overall. I would love to be able to be around for the whole lot of it, but unfortunately there are so many things pulling at my attention at the moment that I'm unfortunately not able to. I feel privileged to be on the same slate as people like Dr. Kao, who just spoke, the dean, and some of the other names that I've seen on this. But my particular focus today, and let me just pull my screen up here. My particular focus is on the use of OSINT in fact-checking and verification. So for journalists, basically. And it's something that has developed an awful lot, but as I will point out, it's not something that's about to change radically. Many of the same practices and skills that have been part of fact-checking and verification for as long as journalism exists have to be applied to this same field also. So the first thing, I'm managing somehow to draw on my screen here, please ignore that. Okay. Just a moment. I'm actually having a small technical difficulty here in that the slides are not advancing for me. Let me just take a moment. Is this a peculiarity of WebEx, I wonder? It's not something if you could possibly turn off annotation for me, that may fix that particular issue. Because I believe it seems to be interfering with the ability to advance the slides. So if the moderator could possibly try that, it could help.
Rajesh, can you help to Sini in doing this thing?
Yeah, because what's happening at the moment is that I have all the annotation tools on screen, but that appears to be possibly preventing me from. Oh, now, yeah. Once I've turned off the annotation tools, now I can advance. Okay, sorry for that. Apologies for that glitch. On we go. So, what I'm going to talk in connection with OSINT and journalism is a very brief history of how this development came up. Just how journalists started to use this on a far broader basis than, say, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. How it is actually being used in journalism. What are the purposes and what are the tools? And how are we actually using OSINT to improve our journalism? Then that will lead into something that over the past 12 months, I've taken a lot more time and effort on, which is the ethical considerations and the need to be extremely careful. Just because we have all these new tools and new competencies and abilities, that we continue to observe the same ethical standards as journalists that we always have. And then I'm going to take the liberty of introducing something that is going to be a major focus of mine in 2021 and possibly on an ongoing basis, which is leveraging OSINT to improve news literacy and where I see the place of this in journalism and in media in the coming months and years, because I think there is a danger that it's very often seen as a niche concern and one that is kind of peripheral to the whole journalistic process. So this is something I've been speaking to some major news outlets and others about, and I'd like to. This will be the first time in any kind of a public forum that I introduce it in a more detailed way. So first of all, just a recap for anybody. This OSINT is a term that's starting to become rather hackneyed, like fake news and other things. It means many things to many people, and there are many competing ideas and definitions of what actually qualifies as OSINT. Of course, it's become one of these buzzwords. I use it in the name of my own small business concern, and I worry that it's going to be one of these things that will mean everything and nothing, and whether I'm going to have to actually change that name and description later on. But for now, let's stick with a very basic definition or a very basic explanation of what the term actually is. And it's, as you can see, a shortened term for open source intelligence. It's a very short term, but of course encompasses so many things, and there's no full agreement on what these, how to define these things. So what is an open source even? I think we could all agree that officially published documents that have been created for public awareness or public information and shared in a public manner will always qualify as being open source. But we have seen many situations in which such documents have been created not with the public in mind. It's quite straightforward to go on Google and to find documents that were initially marked as eyes only or private and confidential or not for public use. And what has happened in a lot of these cases is somebody working in an organization or a company has been looking for a place to store or host a document and has thought, well, it's fine. We have lots of web space in our company or in our organization. We can just throw it in there. But of course, if you do that in a careless manner, it enables it to be found by anybody with a little bit of curiosity and a little bit of expertise. So when documents that were not initially intended to be public are put on the web in such a way that they can easily be found by the public, does this qualify as open source? Some will say it does because they are now in the public domain. Others will say, well, that was accidental. It wasn't meant to happen that way. And I'll address a little bit later how I think journalists should approach such things and how they should deal with such things. Then we have something, of course, which is being searched and analyzed and gathered on a huge basis, which is social media accounts belong to private citizens. Because, yes, of course, we can go on to Facebook, we can go on Twitter, we can look at Pinterest or any of these others, and we can get huge amounts of information about people. And that's all very well, because, again, we can say, well, if it's there and it's open, it's available, that puts it in the public domain. Therefore, it's fair game, it's open source. But as I so often ask people, when you signed up to Facebook, YouTube, any of these platforms, do you remember the terms and conditions? You may have gone through this page with 10,000 words of legalese jargon, and of course you read them all carefully. Of course not. Everybody scrolls to the bottom and clicks that little box that says, I consent or I agree. So I think it's safe to say that the vast majority of the public do not know clearly what they have consented to when they have joined these platforms. Should we be taking advantage of that? Should we be saying, well, they're vulnerable, that's not my problem? So again, how much do we regard these things as being actual open source? And this I'll circle back to when I talk about ethical considerations. Now, of course, OSINT, open source intelligence, is not new. This is something that has been around for a long time. Journalists and others have always been going into repositories of official documents, filing freedom of information requests, and all these kind of things. So these things could all be regarded as being open source. And what you analyze and deduce from them, of course, can qualify as being intelligence. But there has been a huge change, and there has been an absolute explosion in the use of OSINT by not only journalists, but members of the public also. And what has caused this? Well, we all remember where this started. Fortunately, these days, it's a little bit quicker than it was when this graphic was in vogue. But the internet, of course, has made open source intelligence and open source investigation a far broader field. In many ways, a far more democratized field, because it's not the preserve of the expert and professional journalist anymore. Anybody with an internet connection is capable of carrying out such investigation. This, of course, brings with it the risk that many of these people will not have journalistic background, will not have the standards that possibly they should have to be looking at this kind of information, and therefore will do things they should not be doing as a result. Some of you may be aware of this Netflix documentary that was very popular last year. It involved members of the public looking into this quite horrible scenario, this situation where a guy was torturing and killing cats online. And these members of the public used techniques that now, to somebody who's knowledgeable in the area, look quite quaint at times. I saw them trying to geolocate where a person may be, and they were going up and down street after street in Google Maps and Google Earth. And I thought, wow, they're wasting so much time and effort. And then, of course, it came to me that this was actually 12 years ago. What they were doing at the time was quite cutting edge. So if you haven't seen this, it's very interesting in seeing the thought processes, the techniques, and the means that people went through in order to track down this guy and find out where he was and who he was. So it's definitely an interesting window into the early days of OSINT. Many of you then will be familiar with Bellingcat, who, this was started by a guy who was doing it as a hobby in his bedroom, Elliot Higgins. Some of you will be well aware of Elliot. When I knew him, he wasn't even using his real name when I knew him first. And instead of going and joining a major news organization, he crowdfunded the setting up of Bellingcat, who, of course, now have a reputation as being at the absolute cutting edge of doing these kind of online investigations, also work with the New York Times and the BBC and many others worldwide in order to leverage the techniques and practices that Bellingcat has developed and learned and bring these to bear on good public journalism. My own entry into this field came 11 years ago when I joined a small startup in Dublin, in Ireland, called Storyful. And at the time, there were about 5 of us working in the company. I think they have roughly 200 employees now. And they're owned by News International. I spent 6 years with Storyful. In the early days there, I was involved in the development of the techniques and the practices that we used and the standards that we applied to them. And you see on the wall there, this rather grandiose description of Storyful as the world's social media intelligence agency. But certainly when we began in that field, the phrase that necessity is the mother of invention, well, that was very important because many of the things that we learned to do, we had to learn to do them because we had tasks to perform and there was no playbook. So it involved figuring out how to do these things by ourselves. It was a very interesting 6 years I spent with them. I finally moved on, but they're still doing the same things that they were doing 10 or 11 years ago, maybe in more streamlined ways, but the operation is largely still the same, at least in the editorial side of the house. A major watershed moment for Storyful when I was there, and something that caused us to develop things exponentially faster, almost like, you talk about things like the space race or the Cold War, that these things kicked off huge developments and huge changes. For us, that was what came to be known as the Arab Spring. And the point with the Arab Spring, when it came to things like OSINT, was that very early on, it became apparent in countries, particularly Syria, but also others, that professional journalists were not going to be allowed to do their job by the regimes in charge. And we had things like the deaths of journalists, including Marie Colvin, Remy Ochlik, and other people. And it was obvious that journalists could not be pottering around on the ground in these countries, that they risked injury or even death or imprisonment. So early on, we had to depend largely on local sources. Now, in Syria, there sprang up this huge network of groups called local coordinating committees. Every town, city, and even some villages across Syria had one of these. And they were anti-government, anti-regime activist groups who decided that they would record and preserve what was going on. So they would record all of their protests. If they could find evidence of atrocities, they would record these also and they would put them online. They became a major source for us. And of course, they were activists by anyone's definition. And that doesn't mean they were good or bad. But regardless of, when you're dealing with an activist, regardless of whether you agree or not with their aims and with their ideology, you have to accept that they have a particular agenda that they will push quite strongly. What this meant on a day-to-day basis for us at Storyful was we had to find ways of verifying what these activists were providing. And it meant many, many times every day we were looking at photos, we were looking at videos, and we were trying to correlate these with local reports and so on and figure out what was going on. So more than anything else, the Arab Spring, and even amidst the Arab Spring, Syria, created huge impetus for improvements and developments in the practices of OSINT and of online investigation. If I look at what we did in the early days of the Arab Spring, I would now consider it very primitive. But having said that, it was being done with the best tools, excuse me, and the best practices we had available at the time. And like any operation, these were improved and developed as we went on. So what is it that OSINT is actually used for by journalists? And some of the people present will know this very clearly, that when you do get these pieces of content, your first reaction, your first instinct should always be to doubt it. Now, this is not doubt as in the thing that's so common among conspiracy theorists, as that we don't believe anything and we decide ourselves what to believe and we shape our evidence to support that. This is trying to apply, insofar as possible, a scientific process where you doubt everything until you can find actual proof, be that visual or corroborative or so on. And in part, it can be more of a craft than a science, because a lot of the time you're not dealing in absolute confirmation and reality. A lot of the time you're working like a prosecutor or detective or somebody in that field who is trying to eliminate negatives, who's trying to build a compelling case that what they're being told is true or false. So you may have to come at it from many different directions to build up this case. But for us, in those days, we came up with this thing that we always want to try to know: the location, the date and time insofar as possible, and the source. And that has not changed. These are still the three things that you will look for when you're trying to corroborate or trying to find support that something is what it actually purports to be. Location, of course, maps are the big thing. And in the early days, we used pretty much exclusively Google Maps. It had far more information indexed. It was far more developed than any of its competitors. That is still the case in a large percentage of the cases we deal with. But having said that, there are others now. Yandex, for example, is great if you're looking at things coming out of Belarus or any of these East European countries, former Soviet sphere countries, where there's a lot of activity going on at the moment. If you're looking at the protests in Russia, Yandex is probably more often than not going to get you better details on its maps than Google will. The reason being that the Google streetcar is not really allowed to drive around and freely capture imagery in these countries. Yandex is Russian, so it is allowed to operate in these areas. There is one caveat in that the Russian government, after realizing the growing popularity of Yandex, did largely take it under its wing by ensuring that the managing board of Yandex has somebody answerable to the government on it. So there is direct Kremlin involvement in it. And I would say if you're using any of the Yandex tools, they're technically very good, but I would take the information with a pinch of salt if you have to investigate something, the outcome of which could have a bearing on the reputation of the Russian government. Then there are other ones, such as Wikimapia is an amazing tool. Again, we'll go into a little bit later the issue of crowdsourcing information. Wikimapia, if you're not familiar with it, I'm sure you know Wikipedia. Wikimapia is a similar thing, but for maps. So it's crowdsourced information put on maps by members of the public. The downside, of course, of crowdsourcing and free information coming from the public is that you're never quite sure what these people's agenda is, and therefore whether the information is actually reliable. But again, we're journalists. We don't take as reliable something that comes from a single source. So if you're using Wikimapia, you are using it in conjunction with other tools and trying to find that the information you got from Wikimapia is supported by what you see elsewhere. And I'll talk about a case where I did that recently. The upside of it is that Wikimapia tends to attract a lot of hobbyists, casual experts, call them nerds, geeks, whatever you want. So you tend to have a lot of information on a lot of the kind of thing that Google would not bother or find fit to put into Google Maps. They can be very, very helpful in parts of the world where there's conflict, because you will have hobbyists and others who are marking the locations of military checkpoints, ammunition dumps, and so on. Again, can you take an individual's word for that? No, of course not. But you can use it as an indicator to then use other tools to try to check if this is actually accurate. In India, again, Google Maps is very, very limited. It's not allowed to take imagery in a lot of places. One which I do speak to a lot of my Indian contacts about is one called Mapillary. Mapillary is also crowdsourced. I think there is a distinct possibility that it will suffer from its own success, because as more and more imagery turns up on Mapillary, the Indian government may look at it and say, well, all the things that we didn't want Google Earth and Google Maps to be used for are now being done by Mapillary. We're going to have to find a way to limit or restrict that also. Here's just a quick example. I spoke about the Arab Spring and about Syria. This is the kind of thing that we would very often use maps or satellite views for. Claims that a suburb of Damascus was hit by an airstrike. And you're looking at, this is a still from a video. And the task, of course, here is that actually the Damascus suburb that was described in reports of the airstrike? And you can see quite a few things there that, of course, Google is not allowed to drive around Damascus, so we don't have street level views. So you're going to be looking for satellite views. So you look at things here and you say, what would be distinctive from above? And you see a silver dome of a mosque, you see a few buildings around it, you see features of the mosque itself. A minaret can be hard to pick out from a satellite view. Sometimes the angle of the imagery will help. Other times there may be a shadow that clearly outlines the shape of the minaret, and so on. But in this case, it was very possible. And as you can see, it involved going into a satellite view on Google Maps, picking out these little bits and pieces, shapes of buildings, layout of windows on the side of a building, the spatial relationship of these objects to one another. And as you can see, it's a little bit clearer. The image in the video is clearer, but some of the shapes are clearer in the satellite view. For example, one of the arrows there points to a curved facade on the bottom left corner of the mosque, and that's something which can be correlated. Again, these images are very often imperfect, and it involves not only finding each of these things, but divining or figuring out whether they are in the correct spatial relationship to one another that enables you to say, yes, this is certainly the same spot. And in this case, you can see it is so. Last year in India, there was one of these, of course, following the clashes between the Indian and Chinese troops. And this tweet appeared and appears to be an effort to say that the prime minister was very weak in his response to China because look what one of his predecessors did. She went to the Galvan Valley and addressed the troops there. And there was a lot of confusion around this for quite a while. One of my own contacts in India did get in touch with me and say, we don't think this is in Ladakh, but we're at a loss at the moment to figure out where it actually is. Because, of course, if you can say definitively that it's in another place, well, then, of course, you can point out that it's not Ladakh. So it took me a little bit of time looking around. And I did at one point turn to Wikimapia because I saw somebody on Twitter referring to the possibility that it may be in Leh. So I went to Leh on Wikimapia, and one of the first things that jumped out was that some person interested in militaria had said, here is an airbase in Leh. Now I looked at that, and you can see a mountainous region, you can see a large flat expanse, and you can see a long, very straight road in the background. And of course, you start to put two and two together and say, that could very well be an airbase. There are also lots of servicemen there. So at that point, I went into Google Earth. One of the great things with Google Earth is you can tilt the view. And what does this allow you to do? It allows you to examine the topography of an area and look at the lines of mountains and things like that. Now, of course, this is an old picture, but if it is in Leh, this is an area where you're not going to get huge growths of vegetation. It's at high altitude, it's quite arid, and things like mountains will thus not change dramatically, even over quite an extended period of time. I didn't get a perfect thing that made me look and say that's it immediately, but picking out features one by one, I was able to come to a confident conclusion that this was the same range of mountains that I was seeing on the Google Earth view of Leh. You can see that I've had to kind of build it up until I've got 4 or 5 points that I can say at that point, okay, this is too much to be coincidence. This has to be the same area. Another thing I talked about is trying to figure out dates and times. One of the popular things and one of the quick things is to compare the weather you will see in a video or photograph with weather reports from that particular day in that location. If you are told that this video shows Baghdad in June and there is snow on the ground in the background, you can probably guess already for yourself. But what you can also do is check the weather conditions for that day. And if it was 42 degrees, then you know that there's very unlikely to have been a layer of snow in the background. Something that takes things on a bit further is the use of shadows to figure out what time of day something was taken. Now, this analysis of shadows will follow on from getting positive geolocation first, so getting confirmation of where something was actually captured. You need to know where the place is and what the orientation of the camera view is. So you can say to yourself, this shadow is pointing in a particular direction. It may be direct north-south, it may be somewhere else. But in this case, this is just an example where there was a nice sharp shadow in the foreground there, in the mid to background there. And once you can see that shadow and you can figure out the orientation of the street and the buildings in that picture, you can tell what time of day that is. This is a tool that's used for that quite often, and you can see the directions of shadows being correlated with what this tool does is it tells you which direction the sun was shining at a particular point on the Earth's surface at a particular point in time. Then it has a slider at the top, which is also a clock. And, if anybody's interested in going into this in more detail, I can do it at another time. For now, I'll just point out that it's something that I've seen many people use to great effect to figure out what time a video was captured. Then we go to source. And so the source of a piece of content is extremely important for several reasons. One of them, of course, being intellectual property, that if you want to use a piece of content in your own news report, it's very important to be able to contact the source of that and get their consent. And this is something which came home to me in a big way just a few days ago. The lake near my house was frozen. There were many people out walking on it and skating and so on. And the police decided it was a good idea to come along with a helicopter to chase them off. So I shot video of this, and it started to go viral online. And Das Bild, which is the biggest or part of the biggest media house in Europe, but it's here in Germany, decided it would be a good idea to use this in their news report, but didn't see fit to get my permission for it first. So what I'm doing at the moment is using their mistake to squeeze as much money out of them as I can, which I will then donate to charity and use as an example of why media should not do things like this. So it is important wherever possible to try to contact the original source of a piece of content and get their permission for use. Another important part of finding out what the original source of a piece of content is that this enables you then to analyze that person, to find out if they are, for example, in the location where the content is purported to have come from, to find out more things about them, such as maybe their job, maybe clubs and associations they belong to, anything that would have put them in a situation to where it would be feasible that they could have captured this content. But further than this, possible ideology, prejudices, biases that they may have, because of course, whenever we see content, we want to know where it was captured. We want to know when it was captured, but we also want to know why it was captured and disseminated. And whereas we may never be able to say exactly the reasons for this, looking into somebody in such a way that we can find out as much about their background as possible does enable us to surmise certain possibilities about their agenda or their motivation for doing so. And this can give you pause and cause you to reevaluate the possibilities that this was either faked or misrepresented in some way. This again does lead on to further ethical questions, which I will go into in a few moments. But as you can see here, these are all from a single person. And we can see that people tend to be on many different platforms online. They tend to share different little bits of information about themselves on each of those. So the better you get at looking into people and figuring out as much of their online presence as possible, the better you get at figuring out who they are, what they're doing, and what they want, and so on. And this brings me on, quite cleanly, I believe, to the ethical considerations of working with OSINT. Because, as I said earlier, we can now do so much more than we used to be able to. The internet and the amount of things that people put online has enabled us to look into far more things in far more ways than we ever could before. But of course, the question you always must ask yourself is, because I can do something, does it automatically follow that I should do it or that it's a good idea to do it? Of course not, in many, many situations. And one of the things that's happened is, particularly with things like that Netflix documentary, is people have seen these things and they see the work that the likes of Bellingcat does, and it can be very exciting. And that level of excitement can, of course, have connotations or have an impact on your judgment. And you may not always pause to the extent that maybe you should have. And some of this comes from a good place, because as journalists, we love a scoop. We love to be the first to find out something and also the first to share it and to be able to tell people that we were the ones that found it. But we've got to pause. We've got to take a deep breath. We've got sometimes a little bit over the top in this "I was first" idea. I remember one of the major news agencies pointing out that they had broken the news of the death of Michael Jackson 28 seconds faster than their closest competitor. And I think the only people who noticed that were themselves. So it's not always a great idea to try to rush things out there. You know, if I ask rooms full of journalists, and I always ask them the question, do you believe with the statement that it's better to be accurate than to be fast? And everybody says yes. But then if you ask them, do you think if you told this to your managing editor 5 minutes before print or broadcast deadline, you'd get a sympathetic hearing? And very often the answer is absolutely not. So there are huge pressures. There's the competition both within media and within the milieu of competing media organizations to be fast. This has repeatedly led to mistakes. So we have to always ask ourselves these two core questions. One is, how far can we go and how far should we go in the pursuit of information? I mentioned earlier looking at people's social media. Do you, for example, go to somebody's Facebook account and have a look at their about page and see who they are, where they are, and so on? Or do you then continue and start looking into their photo galleries? Do you look at their friends list? Do you then click on one of those friends and go into their account and start trying to correlate and find out things about them? It can be very tempting to go down that rabbit hole, and it can be very easy to suddenly find yourself ethically compromised. And then when you do get this information, what do you actually do with it? How do you use the information that you get? Because I have seen this kind of thing happen over and over again, not just with little groups of people on message boards who are looking into things, but also with journalists. We've all been in that situation where we've got this piece of juicy information and we're wondering, should I use this or not? So these questions we have to very sharply focus on when we are doing OSINT work. This just recently, the whole thing of the people who are attacking the US Capitol. And this phrase, doxing, if you're not certain of it, basically involves making somebody's personal details public, be that their identity, their address, or anything else like that. And this is something that caused a lot of controversy. There was some amazing work done by people identifying members of this mob and naming them and saying, this is where they live, this is where they work. The FBI was appealing and saying, please submit this information to us. But a lot of people saw crowdsourcing as a useful and perhaps permissible way of getting this information in more detail and more quickly. But of course, the more investigators, for want of a better term, that you introduce into the equation, the more possibilities somebody is going to get it wrong. People are going to start seeing what they want to see and forming flawed conclusions. And this has happened. This just turned up on, I think it was Reddit or one of those boards. One of the people who was seen in one of the pictures, people started looking into him, forming associations, drawing conclusions. And here you can see it says he's a retired firefighter with a son who's a cop. And the implication, I think it's this guy, David Quintavalle. And here we are, trolls wrongly accused retired firefighter of Capitol riot murder. So this guy was being linked by casual investigators online with the death of a police officer during the riot at the US Capitol. And it says here he was grocery shopping and celebrating his wife's birthday in Chicago at the time that riot was going on. And I don't think any of us want to be on the receiving end of these kind of accusations. Just as, last week I got a small taste of it. When I put this video of the police helicopter out, I was subjected to a storm of abuse by people who didn't think that I should be criticizing the emergency services. But there you go. So this is what I always try to get journalists to think about when you are looking for a piece of information and you're trying to decide how far to go to look for it and then what to do with it, these three key things are very important. First of all, you look at the need. Do I need to be doing this in this particular way to get the information I want? Do I have to go poking into somebody's list of Facebook friends when there may be another and less ethically questionable way of doing it? Secondly, the value. What is the value of the information I will get by behaving in this way? Will I find out that a government minister is involved in massive corruption? Or will I find out that some celebrity's girlfriend is pregnant, or what their new baby looks like? So you have to try to make an editorial judgment here and say, is it valuable enough for me to do something here which I may not normally do? And then, of course, there are the consequences, both intended and unintended. The consequences for the person involved, and the consequences for yourself and for the people you work for. What you're doing, you hear this, what would I say, this alibi or excuse all the time. Well, what I did was not illegal. But we all know that there are many things that are not illegal, but that will certainly be perceived as ethically flawed or ethically questionable. And you have to decide what I'm doing right now, if this becomes public knowledge, how is that going to affect the reputation of myself and my employer? So finally, I said I was going to stray slightly from the direct description and explanation of OSINT and journalism. This is a slight change of tack for me that in the coming few months, it's something I'm going to be discussing with a lot of people. I'm already talking to one of the people who makes decisions at one of the largest news outlets in the world who is interested in this. And I would love to get feedback from people with the expertise of those attending this seminar. So I'm going to go into it quite briefly, but I would love any opportunity that might arise to expound on these ideas further and to get feedback and the benefit of your expertise. So what I'm talking about is the ways that we use OSINT are often very compelling. They often capture the imagination of the public. And I'm asking myself whether we can use this, whether we can leverage this to increase news literacy, media literacy, even broaden it to information literacy. Because the way I see it at the moment, there are problems with the way news literacy is being approached. Right now, things like this are very much academia driven, and bear with me, I'm not hitting out at academics on this. In fact, I think they're crucial to the process. But it's very often seen as an adjunct to journalism, as a niche pursuit that's just part of the journalistic process from time to time when there's a big event. And the specific time and space allotted to the learning or the teaching of news literacy. The change that I would say that I would like to see, this big sea change that I think would benefit journalism hugely across the board, would be to change this to a more media-driven process. Of course, that does not cut out academia, because academia is going to be where these ideas are going to be developed, where the next generation of journalists are going to come from, and so on. And that rather than being something that we occasionally bring to bear on a story, it should be integral to all the journalism that we're doing. And it should be ever present. It shouldn't be, now let's do a little bit of literacy and OSINT. So I would say that we have to ask ourselves, in the case of every significant story that we report, that we ask ourselves, is there a way that we can, is there something we can bring to bear on this that will help increase the public's, first of all, their news literacy, and secondly, their appreciation of how important news literacy is. So in short, it shouldn't be seen as a separate discipline from regular journalism, that the media somehow incidentally benefits from. Oh, if our readership are more news literate, that's good for us. As media, we should be driving it, because we're not operating in a vacuum now. We're in a milieu in which there are people hostile to journalism, hostile to the media, who are doing everything in their power to create a situation of distrust and of equalizing all reports and all opinions and putting them on the same footing as actual facts. So what I'm saying is that I'm not talking about us doing a feature every so often and saying, this is how to understand the news. This is how to spot that that's a fake story or a fake photograph. Or occasional workshops once a year in not very carefully chosen schools here and there and say, let's do a workshop on news literacy, and then have the students go away and perhaps forget all about it in 2 to 3 weeks. I think it's something that we should be integrating into editorial workflows, that the news literacy angle on any significant story should be as important and as instinctively pushed as a lead, as a headline, as the image that goes with the picture, that we have to get used to always thinking, how is this story likely to be perceived or misperceived? Can we use the OSINT work we have done in this to impress the public that this has been done in a careful way and is therefore more worthy of belief and respect than the videos you're looking at on YouTube or the stuff that your uncle is sending you on WhatsApp? So we have to try to use OSINT, I believe, as a tool for promoting news literacy through everyday practices, everyday standards, and forget about having it as a little feature that we trot out every 6 months. So how do we go about doing this? Well, this is where I suddenly slingshot the academia back into the picture and the process, is that, first of all, we need to train and develop not only the current, but also the future generations of reporters and editors, so that their understanding of OSINT in journalism is that it is, as I said, as important a part of the story as all the things that we have taken for granted for generations. Like I said, this is a new environment. It is an environment where we're not in a privileged position as much as we used to be. We do have people actively out there trying to tear down what we do. So I've had journalists say, why should we change the editorial process in such a profound way? Well, that's exactly why, because there are people on the outside trying to change it to our detriment. Then can we also introduce perhaps a role that involves monitoring this, like things like newspapers, others hiring a standards editor or a public editor? Do we get somebody, at least on a temporary basis until this becomes ingrained in journalistic culture, do we get somebody who goes through all the big stories and say, why don't we do this? Why don't we do this in such a way that people understand the OSINT is making it more credible and more useful to them? And can we do this on a daily basis so that it becomes ingrained in the journalistic culture? Now, I'll get down off my soapbox, and we still should have about 10 minutes for questions here if anybody has any. Of course, questions do not always occur to people immediately. You might go away and in an hour or a day or a week think, oh, you know what, I should have asked him this. Please never hesitate to get in touch with me. Here are my contact details. And if you have any questions, tips, criticisms, suggestions, anything at all, please always feel free to get in touch with me. And I will do my best to get back to you as quickly as possible. But that said, if there are any questions now, please fire away.
Yeah. You can come on the chat or you can come on the WhatsApp group and to ask questions to our friend Susini. And I'm actually, we are waiting for questions from you.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find the chat here. There we go. Yeah, I used to use WebEx quite a lot, and I haven't used it in about 6 months. So I'm kind of looking around. I'll just put in my email as well there, so that
yeah, the university is actually using WebEx. I have already shared.
Yeah,
chat box now. Yeah.
Because I know very often people think, oh, I missed the opportunity to ask a question. Please don't ever miss the opportunity. The opportunity is open.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm never sure when there aren't questions. I'm not sure whether that signifies.
I can start with a question. I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Please do.
Yeah, for all actually. Any OSINT service in the global level is working for the media people. That means a media house or the journalist in a smaller community or a smaller media house can seek their service in getting something fact checked by the OSINT experts. Is any service exist in the world and the globe offering such services?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, the company that I spent 6 years with, Storyful, it was never my side of the house, but a lot of the skills and techniques and processes that we developed in order to carry out editorial, these are often requested by companies and organizations and others to say, look, somebody is trolling our business and posting rumors about us or whatever. And they will actually go and ask Storyful, can you help with things like this? They'll ask about social media campaigns and how to avoid making stupid mistakes in social media campaigns. So we often, when I worked there, when I'd speak to our CEO, I would try to push the importance of the editorial department. I'd say, look, we're the space program here. We're the guys who, out of necessity, have to develop cutting edge techniques and so on, which are then of use to the B2B side of the house or the brands cooperation side of the house. Yeah. So many of the things that were most immediately urgent were then able to be used later by other parts of the house. And I'm absolutely sure, I can't name others, but Storyful has so much success with that I'm sure it's being duplicated by other companies elsewhere.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Any other questions?
As I say, I'm never sure when there's silence whether that signifies satisfaction or bewilderment.
Yeah. Yeah, nobody is asking question, I think.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, it's like I say, the questions may not occur to people immediately, and I am there to answer questions if anybody has any later.
So anybody has a question, you can contact Srini through that email. He'll be ready to answer your questions. Okay.
And thank you, Jignesh.
Yeah. Thank you, Srini, very much. Thank you very much for cooperating with us. And shortly, Jignesh is asking some question. Am I right? You know Jignesh?
Jignesh is just he's signaling satisfaction. But there is something else there that somebody said. Sometimes I found I'm annoying people when I'm debunking fakes. Absolutely, because a lot of people want to believe these things and can be quite indignant when you crash their party and when you destroy their illusions. But unfortunately, all I can say on that is that's the price of doing the right thing.
So, I have a question for you.
Yeah, sure.
So,
long time no see, Jignesh. I hope you're well.
So there is, So there is, I mean, there's this ethical question of, when you are researching on people who are doing, violent acts or something that is, I mean, by the law, I mean, illegal. And then you're doing to try to find out, I mean, who is that person who is committing that crime. And in doing that, if you, I mean, access their social media or their records and you try to find them out, I mean, do you think it becomes like a moral question? I mean, or
absolutely, do you think, yeah. That's where I bring that triangle into play. I can send you more detailed notes on the triangle graphic I had up there, but yeah, I think you have to make these judgments. How important is it that I find this information? How useful is the information going to be? And am I satisfied that the result of this investigation will be such that if the public knows how I found the information, they'll be okay with it? So you have to put these things together and say, okay, now that I have decided on how all these things go, am I going to go ahead? I think editors' jobs are very important there, because I know many editors will say, we need you to do this, and I will back you to the hilt if it gets found out that we've done it in this way. You have to also be very clear in recording the steps you have taken and be prepared to justify those if you're ever questioned about them. Because if you can't justify them to yourself in the first place, it'll be very hard to justify them to the public.
Because I mean, one of the
Yeah,
sorry.
carry on. You proceed, please. Yeah.
So a lot of the times, I mean, what happens is that the party that is hurt, I mean, either of the party that is hurt by the hosting skills that you practice, claims doxing. I mean, that happens with every side. I mean, this is the final argument when
Yeah.
Even if you make that moral judgment that somebody has committed crime on camera, but then also, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, but I think there are no absolutes in morals and ethics, and very often what that comes down to is somebody is not complaining about what you did, except they're complaining that you caught them. that's their objection. They're complaining that they were exposed.
Thank you.
Sonia from NDTV is here. Sonia Bhaskar from NDTV is here. Hello, Sonia.
Yes.
I think you remember Sonia.
Of course, Sonia. Yes, absolutely. We were briefly in touch just recently.
Sonia, do you have any questions for Srini? No, she is not responding. Okay.
It may be an audio problem.
Okay.
If you do have a question, Sonia. So let me quickly, if you do have a question, Sonia, and if you're in a position that you can't ask it right now, please just message me and I'll get back to you.
Yes. Dr. Lajish here from the Department of Computer Science, who is hosting the webinar. So, as you mentioned about the academia, so what we feel is we are still in a watertight compartments. We keep the computer science aside, journalism separately, and business studies separately. So, what we find is that the pressure is from the government side to come up with a common curricula for the entire undergraduate and postgraduate students to in a media literacy. So, what do you think about or coming up with a detailed curricula, including the technical aspects of that and the theoretical part of the journalism, etc., together? So, we will sum up the entire 2 days deliberations together and come up with a proposal to make a audit course for the entire student community, so that zero credit course, of course, this can be handled in online courses. So that is our idea. So do you have any suggestions regarding this?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't claim to have any of the technical expertise or even the background in the Indian educational system. I think that's not just me throwing the responsibility back onto you, but I'd be very reluctant to claim any expertise in something that I clearly don't have. But certainly conceptually, in terms of making this part of a holistic curriculum, that like you say, we can't just pigeonhole all these things and keep them apart from each other. So I would be very happy to make any contribution that people on your side would deem useful or necessary. But I think I would have to be involved in some pretty lengthy and deep discussions with you guys first, because you know the situation on the ground far better than I ever will.
That is great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
So much.
We will close at this point and let us start the next session. Thank you
very much for having me.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Let us invite Dr. Christine for the next session. I think Reshma can go ahead now.
Thank you, sir. The last session was really a wonderful one. And we are coming to the end of today's sessions. And the last session for today's webinar series is Infodemic Management for Better Health, which will be handled by the most suitable resource person from World Health Organization, who is a technical officer. And infodemic management is applying evidence-based interventions that bring understandable, localized, evidence-based information to citizens and drive positive health-seeking behavior. The history of public health in the 20th and 21st century is full of examples of how misinterpretation caused harm during outbreaks and continue to do damage in trust in health authorities long afterwards. The tools at health authorities' disposal have been limited and expertise slowed. Today, our guest speaker from World Health Organization, Christine Cherniak, is going to talk on infodemic management for better health outcomes. Chris is serving as a technical officer in the Global Infectious Hazards Preparedness Department of World Health Organization's Health Emergency Program. She is also a part of WHO infodemic management team and fighting against infodemic just like fighting against epidemic. Madam, I invite you to this community to deliver the session. Welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the welcome. And just bear with me a moment while I work on trying to get my video connected here. And may I say that I'm delighted to see all of the wonderful effort the team is making here in raising awareness about the infodemic and the need to become aspiring infodemic managers. Okay, are you seeing my presentation now?
Yes, but not in full screen, Christine. Dr. Rajesh, can you help her? Yeah, in sharing the screen.
Yeah, ma'am, please make it presentation mode. Could you please make it? Yeah.
The presentation format, actually, full screen. Can you make it full screen?
Yes, we're working on it. Do you see? Is that showing up for you now?
Okay, you can continue now. I think.
Excellent.
No.
You see it full screen?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. Delighted to be here. And today I would like to talk to you a little bit about the global context for the challenge of infodemics that we're facing, and provide a little bit more context about what we're doing on the global stage, and also provide some quick tips for everyone to become an aspiring infodemic manager. So I think we're all on the same page at this point of the pandemic and this point of the infodemic, in terms of seeing that there are a lot of challenges in our communication ecosystem right now surrounding confusion, misinformation, just a lot of general worry and anxiety as well about what decisions we need to make, what behaviors we need to practice. So if we zoom out for a minute and think back to about a year and a few days from today, the World Health Organization Director General made the point about the twin challenges that we're facing, that we're not just fighting an epidemic, that we're also fighting an infodemic. And what do we mean by infodemic, right, by this term? So an infodemic is really referring to this sudden excess amount of information that is coming out about COVID-19, and this can be a mix of good and bad information. This can also include information gaps. And altogether, this volume of information, this velocity of information, and this challenge with veracity of information is making it really difficult for people to know what decisions to make for their health. So here I'll just flag up a quick key distinction, and you may have already focused on this in the previous talks, but it's important to distinguish, I think, for us between misinformation, which is information that might be harmful and incorrect, but is not shared with the intent to deceive. So lots of us are very sincere and wanting to help inform the people that we care about around us about what they should be doing, but sometimes get it wrong. And disinformation, that's really where there's malicious actors who are intending to try and deceive. And the challenge here that we're seeing is that this can cause real harm in the public health space. So the infodemic has been leading to a lot of confusion and some serious risk-taking behaviors. I think we'll all remember some really tragic cases about methanol poisoning and deaths associated with that, and the use of unsafe cleaning products as well. And so I think I would say that there's also a lot of polarization about some of the public health measures, such as mask wearing, for example, that stems from this kind of confusion. And in order to tackle this, there's a need for us to better understand our communication ecosystem. So if we're looking at where we are today versus 100 years ago, obviously the situation is quite different, the communication system that we're operating in, right? So we understand that through digital media, it's possible to share information and misinformation a lot more rapidly. And I want to be really clear here that, this is not a place for us to be finger pointing or assigning blame for digital platforms, because they're also providing this really extraordinary opportunity to share helpful information to ensure that there's better access to credible information about health and other topics. But of course, given the nature of the beast, it's also possible to see rapid viralization of harmful messaging. So I think the key here is that we really need to tackle information from a more holistic, whole of society approach. And I want to emphasize too that we tend to focus a lot on the online situation, and I appreciate where this team is coming from, computer science, that we're thinking very much about the online challenges. But I want to flag up too that offline challenges for public health emergencies have been an issue for, as long as there have been public health challenges. So for example, one thing I can think about is in France in the 1800s, I think it's the 1830s, there was a cholera outbreak. And obviously there was no internet or social media platforms back then, but there was a conspiracy theory that was making the rounds offline about the illness being a hoax. And actually there was a theory that it was doctors trying to poison the working class. So here, I think we need to take away that there's a need to integrate online and offline measures to be able to reach everyone through all the different communication channels that we're seeing. And then the aim here, obviously, is to be able to better manage this pandemic by better managing our communication and ensuring healthy communication. So I think we're all on the same page at this point about what the challenges are. The question now is, what are we going to do about it, and what have we been doing about it? So it's been a very busy year. I think there have been, we're in the hundreds now for press conferences at the World Health Organization, 50 Mythbusters. I think there have been 50 reports on the infodemic coming out. There's a lot that's been happening, 3 global conferences. And I won't go into all the details here. I'll talk a little bit more about these things. But the point that I really want to emphasize is that this field of infodemiology, which is the science of infodemics, and infodemic management as an emerging discipline, it's quite nascent. So this is a newer field where there's a lot of work that we need to do together in terms of developing out a framework, a strategy, an action plan. And so WHO has been working on trying to crystallize that through expert consultations. There's a need to also develop the science of infodemiology. And I want to draw everyone's attention to the fact that we will have, there has been a joint call for papers for special issues on infodemiology, and these will be forthcoming this year. So watch this space. And there's a need to, on the practical side of things, so, we need to study the science of infodemiology to understand how things are operating and what we can do about it. But there's also a need to rapidly develop some tangible tools that countries can use and partners can use to try and tackle this challenge. And developing the profession is also really critical. So, I think we've been relying on the historical model of risk communication and community engagement globally. And by we, I mean, I think everyone in the public health emergency response here. And, we're realizing that there are some gaps and there's some areas ripe for advancement. And so developing this profession of infodemic managers is going to be really helpful for plugging those gaps and being able to roll out new tools and services. So there's a need for us to innovate and a new toolbox for infodemic management. We need to look at what kinds of new analytics and metrics and methods we're going to be able to bring to bear, and what kind of sustainable data sources we're going to have. So one challenge, for example, is that teams have been relying a lot on surveys, right? So there are these surveys about knowledge and attitudes and practices and things that can be rolled out to try and hear from the community what's happening in a given context. And, these are great, but one of the challenges is that by the time you get the results, this is already past behavior, past concerns, past attitudes. And we need something that's going to be able to give us more rapid information to be able to respond more quickly and have more targeted engagement of communities. So zooming out for a second here and thinking about how we're going to advance this discipline of infodemiology and infodemic management, because this is a new and evolving area of research and practice. The World Health Organization has brought together experts from 20 different disciplines from around the world through an expert consultation process in order to develop a public health research agenda for managing infodemics. And this has 5 streams or focal areas of work and 65 key research questions. And the intention here is to really help focus the research and innovation and focus the investment in the areas where we're seeing critical gaps and need to accelerate progress. So thinking about different areas that we need to explore, there's a lot we still don't know. So for example, how is the infodemic affecting closed networks and vulnerable populations? I mentioned before this challenge of people who are in the offline space and maybe less engaged online. We see differences across age groups, for example, in how people are accessing internet and social media platforms. There's also a question of how to try and mitigate this issue or counter this issue of health misinformation in terms of policy interventions. And this is an area that I'll touch on more later, and I think is something that we need to be very cautious about how we're approaching things from a top-down perspective, because we need to bear in mind that we all need to be protecting freedom of speech. And this really isn't about censorship. This is about promoting healthy dialogue, respecting a plurality of perspectives, and then building our resilience to misinformation. We really need to better understand how the infodemic, what the impacts are on cognition and how that's influencing how people are then seeking out health services, how overwhelming amounts of information from the infodemic are just largely affecting behavior in emergencies. And we need to be able to test interventions or community engagement strategies and see what is actually effective, because there's a lot of chat right now about things that we should or shouldn't be doing and how we're approaching the infodemic and misinformation, but really we need a research and evidence-based approach to know what's going to work well, and also bear in mind there may be some unintended consequences that we have to consider as well. So in terms of coming up with this research agenda and trying to advance our understanding of infodemic management and infodemiology, to have this evidence-based framework, I think this is going to really aid us in being able to integrate infodemic management as a profession, as a series of skills, as a series of tools into epidemiological preparedness and response plans. And the aim here is that we want to be able to flatten the infodemic curve in order to help flatten the epidemic curve. And so this is kind of a useful analogy, I think. So if we think about, the epidemic management process, right? So epidemiologists, their first step is really to engage in surveillance to try and detect an emerging health threat. And so similarly, from the infodemic side, we need to boost our tools and techniques for being able to listen, to pick up on emerging concerns as they're arising and before they, there's viralized confusion, right? The second phase in the epidemic response is, trying to manage the emergence of the virus, right, and the spread of the virus. And so for the infodemic, for us, that's really trying to, I don't know if contain is the right word, but better manage the spread of harmful narratives and promote the sharing of constructive narratives. And then the third phase, which is, emergence of the disease, I think in terms of consequences, what we're seeing here on an incredibly large scale is increasing distrust in authorities. We're seeing erosion of social cohesion. And this really is a strong call to action for us to think about what kinds of interventions are going to be needed, both to manage the impacts of the infodemic, but also just more broadly to strengthen public health systems and to strengthen the resilience of individuals and communities right now. So for aspiring infodemic managers out there, I would say, this is the process we're looking at right now, is being able to build out our capacities for measuring and monitoring the impact of the infodemic. We want to be able to detect and understand the spread of information, what is driving the spread of misinformation and disinformation, and what's aiding the spread of helpful narratives, and respond in a way that's going to be appropriate and adaptive to the changing needs of the situation and communities in order to build that resilience. If we now focus more specifically on the COVID-19 situation, the pandemic that we're dealing with right now, trying to apply this in practice, what this means for infodemic management is that we are focused on 4 priority areas right now. So the first is listening to the concerns and questions and comments that people have from a place of empathy, trying to seek understanding. It's not a place of judgment. And then the second priority here is to better communicate evidence and risk in a way that is going to be more timely and easy to understand and easier to translate into practical and sustainable action. And I think the third point here for promoting resilience to misinformation, I want to emphasize that here again, this is about protecting freedom of speech and promoting healthy dialogue, a healthy communication ecosystem, and building up our capacity, our tools for being able to better manage misinformation. And lastly, the fourth priority, and this is something that I can't emphasize enough, is better engaging, keeping, and empowering people and their communities to take action. So for listening, starting with the first priority, we really need to first have a better understanding of how people are receiving and processing and acting on information. And, this includes better research into how information is originating, evolving, and spreading through different platforms and fora. And to better listen to concerns, this is where we run into challenges where, there's a lot of heavy lifting for teams trying to do this manually on social media, tracking particular keywords, creating lists, etc. There are some tools out there in this space, but I'll say that they're not all equally accessible to public health officials. They cost money, which, money is always tight in an emergency response where you want to be directing it to your top priority issues. And then the other challenge too here, as I mentioned earlier, is that any kind of polling or survey work that's being done to help triangulate results is great, but we're always feeling like we're behind. right? When we get that information, things could have already marched on and people are now concerned about different issues or different narratives are emerging. And so the key here is to develop more advanced digital listening approaches. And so the World Health Organization is using this digital listening approach to analyze and quantify information, picking out keywords and topics to track, to be able to identify trends, hopefully before they're already at a critical point for earlier intervention. And I want to flag up in particular, I'm just going to have a sip of water first. I want to show one example of the innovation that we're working on right now. So this early AI-supported response with social listening, or EARS, as we call it for short, is a pilot project right now running in 20 countries and 4 languages. It's already available online, so you can click this link here and go check it out for yourself and peruse what's happening. And the idea here is that because of limitations with current systems for being able to track online information, which really tend to be more focused on looking at simple sentiment analysis, which is maybe useful for brand reputation management, corporate communications, but less so for informing teams who are rapidly running for the emergency response and need to know what are the gaps in understanding to develop new technical guidance, new materials, how do they need to evolve their approach. So this can help address that gap. And I think the really exciting thing here is that using this AI to be able to detect a rise in people's concerns and questions and comments around a particular topic, we're able to see, what issues are rising and intervene at an earlier point based on these publicly shared comments to create a more finely targeted and tailored approach to community engagement and risk communication. And this is especially helpful too because resources are so limited. And so this helps to better direct resource allocation so that we see a greater impact, greater return on investment. And so I encourage everyone to take a moment and just, go to this link, whoinfodemic.citybeats.com, and you can play around looking at, what are the key topics that are emerging in terms of volume, and there are a lot more analytics. So this is the front end that you're seeing, the public dashboard right now, and what we're doing in parallel is developing a back end dashboard that is a space whereby countries can include different sources of data, so different structured data. I mentioned knowledge, attitude, practices surveys as an example of other kinds of data that can be fed in to try and triangulate and figure out through a mixed methods approach what are the priority concerns of communities at a given time, and also really useful to be able to compare across countries to see, if a particular country, there's more questioning around variants for the virus, for example, then that gives us a steer that there's more communication about that needed. Whereas in another country, if there's, more confusion about a vaccine rollout, then that gives the country a good signal that maybe there needs to be more clarity about the prioritization of that rollout through phases. So exciting work here, and I think resource permitting, this is something that can be upscaled to cover more countries globally and really provide that global picture. And further develop the analytics. And we're very interested in hearing from people who are happy to give feedback on this platform. It's currently in development, and take it for a spin and see if we can get some case studies coming out of this and also evaluating impact. The nice thing about the EARS approach as well is that it's an opportunity to also try and pick up and detect whether public health measures are to what extent they're effective in a given period of time. So, once you've got a baseline for what the concerns are of the community here, then you have, your community engagement or your risk communication campaign, your media campaign or other measures. And then you can look for a change in the conversation that's happening to see if you're having an impact on those particular issues. So the next priority for being able to better communicate the evidence and the risk is really about trying to evolve our approaches for providing the right information at the right time and in the right way. And so it's good for us to all be on the same page here that, practically speaking, it isn't possible to prevent an infodemic entirely. It's not possible to eliminate an infodemic entirely because, looking at that big picture, it's about just an abundance of information, excess information. It's also about information gaps and that mix of good and bad messaging. But I think it is possible for us to develop our infodemic toolkit so that we're better managing it. And really here I want to emphasize again the need to work together in terms of identifying, testing, and evolving the best practices so that we can continue to advance the approaches here. And the teams, who are working on the response, they've been incredibly busy rolling out all sorts of helpful bits of information to try and make it really simple to see, what are key protective measures, to protect ourselves and also those around us. And now coming to the third priority of promoting resilience to misinformation, here is where I think we're seeing a lot of challenges right now in this space. And there's a temptation to focus on censorship approaches. And I think one of the things we need to be very mindful of is that really the overall aim here is to ensure universal access to credible health information as a fundamental human right. And so what that means is learning new tools and techniques and supporting communities in developing their resistance or resilience to misinformation. And, engaging and empowering communities, this is something where I think we need to all remember that communities are at the heart of all of this work. And so the World Health Organization, in association with partners such as UNICEF and the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, are working through a collective service to unite for risk communication and community engagement so that, they're providing coordinated support to communities. And I think a key thing to note here is that a challenge when there's an emerging health threat is that there's a temptation for the experts to quickly amongst themselves figure out, what is the problem, what are the proposed solutions, and that can come out as a rather top-down process where then, measures are rolled out and communities and individuals are expected to suddenly comply. And what we're seeing is that model doesn't really work. I think that having a participatory approach with communities is more effective. And in particular, there needs to be more attention for preparedness and response plans to promote two-way dialogue with communities earlier in the process. And by earlier in the process for this trust building, I mean, even before emergencies are happening. So this should be an ongoing process of trust building and relationship building, and with all different stakeholder groups, with faith-based organizations and faith communities, with youth groups, with civil society organizations. We really need a whole of society approach here, and engaging all of those different stakeholder groups and communities. We need to engage them in a process of co-development and co-design of these public health measures to have better buy-in from an earlier stage. And it's also critical as well to have these communication channels up and running, before an emergency is happening, so that when there is an emerging health threat, there's already that strong relationship there, and it's possible to move more rapidly together in terms of more practical and sustainable actions that people are already primed to run with. And I won't go into all the details of the numbers of of webinars and things we've been doing, but I will say that we have a constant stream, it feels like, of webinars on different topics, and we'll invite you to, at the end of this talk, see that page so that you can connect to the ongoing development of this area of research. The WHO has also been hosting global conferences, convening these different stakeholder groups together to try and support the response both to this particular COVID-19 pandemic, but also bearing in mind the need to further strengthen the coordination and relationships and trust here to prepare for future health threats as well. We know that COVID-19 is not going to be the only health challenge we're going to be facing in our lifetime. So this is a high priority for us. I think the final thing that I want to touch on here, and I think you've already had some really nice information coming at you, so perhaps this is mainly for reinforcement, are some tips for becoming an infodemic manager, because this is a space where we have noted some gaps that need to be filled, and there's a lot of opportunity for advancement for how we're managing infodemics. And here the cartoon, I'll say that we call our infodemic managers unicorns, because it feels like there's a need for them to have a very rare combination of a bunch of diverse different skills, being able to have a lot of digital technical skills, monitoring and evaluation skills, be really strong on the behavioral sciences, on risk communication, having the technical understanding of the public health measures for the outbreak response, being able to train other people in their networks. It's really extraordinary what we're asking people to do. And to assist with the development of this profession, the World Health Organization launched the very first global training for infodemic managers in November this past year. And it was a really exciting initiative, bringing together diverse participants from almost 300 participants from nearly 80 countries. And these are people who are representing all different areas of expertise. So, journalists, public health experts, communication specialists, behavioral specialists, technical experts, and this was an opportunity for everyone to come together and look at the scope of the problem, identify, what are the key gaps in the response right now? What do we need to boost in terms of preparedness for future threats, and how can we continue to improve the current response so we can flatten that infodemic curve to help get us out of the pandemic as soon as we can. And so I'll say there are more trainings being planned. So definitely important to watch our space, and I'll share the website at the end, because there will be opportunities to get involved there. And some tips now. This is a point I've hit on, and I want to continue to emphasize, is that the aim here is really to go beyond focusing on one element specifically of the infodemic, which is, countering misinformation and disinformation, to look at how we promote a healthier communication ecosystem globally to ensure universal access to credible health information. Again, people need it fast, they need the right information, and they need it delivered in a way that's easy to understand and operationalize. So for ease of access to reliable health information, both online and offline, some of the things that are on the agenda here would be thinking about the possibilities of developing a top-level trusted domain. There were efforts in the past to look at the possibility of a .health domain, where people would know that they could all go to that particular type of website to get verified, credible health information from experts, best information available at the time. And we all know that search algorithms are, potentially a challenge, but also a source for good. So ensuring that access to credible, reputable sources of information are front-loaded for people's searches is incredibly useful here, especially when time is of the essence for an emergency response. Another thing I would like us all to think about more carefully is how we can bridge our social bubbles to get out of these echo chambers that we find ourselves in. I think all of us talking here today, for example, we're all champions for managing the infodemic. And I think there's a lot of goodwill and interest among different public communities as well to try and figure out how to do this. But I think it starts with each and every one of us individually making an effort to intentionally, willfully expose ourselves to different perspectives and different communities, and engage from a place of empathy and understanding to better challenge ourselves to think outside of our own specific worldview, which can be quite limiting in terms of how we're filtering our information. And I touched on before the challenge of being able to reach some vulnerable communities or marginalized communities. And one of the challenges we run into is, information is not necessarily always available in all of the languages that communities are using. And so that can be a major barrier, the language barrier itself for accessing this important information. And then for timing and transparency, the point here is that when there's a health emergency or any kind of emergency, I think the temptation is for experts to want to figure out, when it's a novel situation, what is actually happening, look for the evidence before communicating about what's happening. And the challenge with this approach, which is rather conservative, is that this tends to create information vacuums that can be filled with lots of conjecture and misinformation and disinformation. And there's also a challenge of eroding trust and social cohesion when people feel like they're not hearing from the experts from the earliest phases of an emergency. So I think, all of us thinking about how to support our public health authorities and other authorities and each other in terms of communicating earlier on and just being really transparent about what we know and what we don't know, I think will really help. And I think, we need to all be a little bit flexible and open-minded and understanding that at the earliest stages of a response, when there's a new threat, we're not going to have all of the evidence about a situation. But this is where we can really, apply our critical thinking skills to be able to, in addition to, responding to particular evidence, when there's a paucity of it, because that science process is ongoing, I think we can better support each other in engaging with more nuanced risk versus benefit analyses. So, for example, if we think about the public health measure of wearing masks to protect ourselves and each other, there may not be all of the studies that we would want to see. Yet science is not a static body of knowledge. It's an ongoing process of learning and discovery. And, we need to be flexible to move with that process. And I think we need to expect that public health measures will change. And that's a very good thing because it means they're responding to the science. But, thinking about the potential cost of wearing a mask personally versus the benefit of what that can achieve in terms of better protection for ourselves and each other, really will help to address that polarization that we're seeing there. And of course, digital literacy, we're talking about how the, online opportunities for information sharing can be a source for good. But of course, not everyone has equal access to the internet or these platforms. And so that's an area where we need to see continuing investment and development. And media literacy, being able to understand the differences in leanings of different sources, what the motivations are there, and just being able to better understand what's driving a particular communication platform will also, I think, be critical in terms of our ability to be mindful of where information is coming from and potential limitations of any one particular communication source. And all of these things, are going to feed into overall improving health literacy, our ability to understand information in a way that we can make more informed decisions about how to protect ourselves and each other. So a few tips, and hopefully you've seen these, and this will be a reinforcement for you for being able to manage misinformation and disinformation in daily life. I think the idea here is, we want everyone to become an infodemic manager in their daily life. So one of the key tips I can share is to really pick your battles. I think it's important for us to be able to distinguish between, trolls, malicious actors, where, the likelihood of de-radicalizing or changing their minds is less in terms of the amount of investment of time and energy that it would take to try and do that. I think the time and effort would be better spent instead focusing on trying to connect truth seekers to credible information to help them make more informed decisions. So being selective about how we're engaging I think is just a helpful tip overall for all of us, so for anyone else out there who is looking at a comment section of a blog or a news article or on social media and feeling really angry or sad or despairing, bon courage. I think you can actually make a difference by trying to share information with people. There's a silent majority essentially who are undecided about issues and I think are very open-minded to receive new information. So focusing our attention there is very helpful. And then, we see that there are some different rumors and conspiracy theories that emerge and get circulated. And I think all of us, when we see an issue like that emerging, there's an opportunity for us to act very quickly to inoculate our network by, sharing that this information is potentially harmful because we know that prevention is better than cure. And by inoculate, so just like when you get a vaccine, for example, and it's a tiny little bit of deactivated virus, for example, the aim is to be able to give a little tiny bit of exposure so the immune system mounts a good, healthy response. Then when there's more exposure later, you have a really quick response to that virus. So same idea here is that we don't want to actually restate the conspiracy theory or rumor when we're doing this, because there's some research suggesting that if it will resonate with a person's worldview, then this familiarity of hearing about it repeatedly is actually more likely to make them vulnerable to accepting the conspiracy theory, essentially. And so if you're, trying to do this inoculation, or if you're trying to counter, more explicitly conspiracy theories that are circulating, then it's really important to not be repeating the conspiracy theory, the harmful message itself when you're doing this, focusing instead on providing the factual, helpful information that addresses that issue. And if you do need to address a particular conspiracy theory, then at least make it a truth sandwich. So this is the technique whereby you start out with the factual information that's helpful. You put it in the context of a particular source of confusion, and then you quickly restate, the correct information, the helpful information, in order to leave that as a lasting impression with people. And that's more effective. Another point I want to emphasize here is that, it's easy to, when we're feeling frustrated and worried about a situation, to maybe get into a little bit of an adversarial mode, where we get frustrated with people online who are sharing information that we think might be harmful. And here it's again really important to distinguish between malicious actors who may be trying to destabilize global health and security versus people who have good intentions but maybe just don't have the right information or a full understanding of the situation yet. And I think all of us are vulnerable to misinformation, right? So flagging misinformation is a great thing to do, but really engaging people to try and understand where they're coming from, I think, is a more effective approach to try and open them up to new understanding and to changing their minds. And to do this, I can't emphasize enough, actually, how important it is to first establish trust and a rapport with people. Try and find some source of common ground and common interest. If you're perceived as being more relatable, part of a person's tribe, then they're more likely to listen to you. So, in the comment sections, just coming out with a really oppositional point is less likely to be successful than trying to engage and understand where they're coming from. And I think if we're all willing to change our minds as new information, new evidence comes to light, that leading by example with that kind of open-mindedness also helps to inspire other people to be more open-minded as well. And to help, facilitate and foster that kind of open-mindedness, there's a technique that's really useful here, whereby rather than just trying to hit someone with a counterpoint, right, online, is asking them to explain in more detail why they think something is true. So by asking a series of why questions, after maybe 3 or 4 or 5 why follow-up questions, people can pretty quickly realize the limitations of their knowledge, that it's maybe a fairly superficial understanding that they had, and they realize that they have some knowledge gaps. And that process in and of itself helps to open people up to new sources of information and make them more willing to change their minds and to share more helpful information. So I think I will close with drawing your attention to a wealth of resources on infodemic management. So do see our infodemic management webpage and keep in touch there in order to see a lot of new programming that's coming out this year. And I think, what we're realizing at this point in this developing field is that infodemic management is really, saving lives during health emergencies and acute health events. It's absolutely an important part of the equation to be able to address health misinformation as a part of this broader infodemic challenge. But we need to look at the bigger picture of how to foster healthy communication in order to promote healthy behaviors. And so there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in terms of figuring out how together we can reduce the burden of the infodemic on morbidity and mortality, and investing in developing and maintaining trust in health authorities and the health service delivery and public health responses overall, and in each other. This is something where leading with empathy and respect and leading by example, I think, goes a long way. And figuring out how we can try and inoculate against some of these things to boost our resilience, reducing our susceptibility to health misinformation and promote healthier behavior is really useful. And I would encourage everyone to sign this petition where we're all committing to being an infodemic manager in our daily lives, and see our website about the infodemic response. And please subscribe to our infodemic management newsflash so you can stay up on all the latest information about infodemiology and infodemic management. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Yeah, we are waiting for questions actually. Questions.
Ma'am, could you please close the presentation so that we can.
Yes. Oh, it looks like we're having a technical challenge. I might have to restart and re-enter.
Yeah, any questions? I have a question for you, Christine. This is Sunil here.
Hello, I've returned.
Yeah.
Pardon, the computer decided a restart was in order.
Okay, actually, I'm keeping in touch with Anand and Tim, as you know, in Geneva. Yeah. Okay. Is there any separate division started or any separate program started for the COVID vaccine misinformation, vaccination misinformation?
Oh, having a little bit of trouble hearing you. Can you kindly restate the question?
Yeah. So any program recently started, WHO recently started on COVID-19 vaccination misinformation, handling COVID-19 vaccination information.
Oh goodness. Yes, I mean this is one of many things that the World Health Organization is working on right now. So the risk communication and community engagement pillar, these are teams that are working in every region in the countries with local partners to be able to support effective community engagement and communication. And I would say that it's much broader than just looking at the misinformation. It's also a matter of trying to get people the right information to better understand what is our current what is the current state of the science, what is the current state of the local public health program, what are the opportunities for improving our public health measures and our personal practices to be able to better support the pandemic response. And as a part of that, I would say there is work in terms of rumor tracking to be able to try and figure out what are the emerging narratives and sources of confusion so that there's the ability to more finely tailor and target the response in terms of the communication. And that goes back to what I was chatting about earlier in terms of there being different methodologies for doing that. And for the online space, one of the ways we're doing that is through an AI-supported social listening platform where we're able to pick up emerging questions and concerns, hopefully at an earlier phase going forward, to be able to respond more quickly to emerging concerns. But the value of having conversations with local partners on the ground offline as well is a key part of this too. Over.
Yeah, this you talked about the AI supported mechanism, and I understand that the people at the University of Calicut, including the Dr. Rajesh, the computer science department, they are also running a program for the identifying misinformation using this AI, artificial intelligence. And I think you can work with here. You can also work with him. He can also share their experience especially for the regional languages in India, because a lot of misinformation is spreading here. As you know, even the health workers are not.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think such communities in different parts of the world can cooperate in translating the information provided by you and spreading it and delivering it in the local communities. that will be wonderful, I think. Yeah, again.
Yeah, so I'm really glad to hear you talking about all of us playing a role in being champions of truth and spreading the good information to help people know, be able to parse the fact from fiction. That's really good. And I think we know that vaccines have been saving lives since the 1700s. And although the details of the science behind them are continuing to advance, the goal here of inoculating ourselves against harms remains the same. And, this is true for inoculating against infectious diseases and inoculating ourselves against harmful messages, right? That may be unintentionally shared or an attempt for malicious actors to destabilize progress. And I would say that, again, it's important for us to keep our critical thinking skills going and keep that flexibility to change our minds and change our approaches for better health outcomes. We want to see public health measures evolving over time because based on new information, that means they're responding to the science, right? It's that method and process of learning and discovery that gives us the most helpful framework we have as humanity to guide and revise our decision making to protect our health and the health of everyone around us. And I think part of that is respect for other people in having questions. I think we're all united in having questions. We're in a new situation. We are rolling out new approaches to be able to deal with these challenges, as well as some tried and tested, approaches. And I think we need to encourage questioning. That's a healthy thing as part of a healthy dialogue. But there's a difference between, raising concerns and asking questions and then intentionally trying to mislead people, right? Which is the disinformation space. So I would say our approaches for handling misinformation are quite different from handling disinformation. Over.
Thank you, ma'am. Actually, this session was very interesting as well as very informative. Especially your slides are very thought-provoking in that sense. So definitely, the Department of Computer Science, we have been working in fact-checking area for the last 3 years in collaboration with Queen's University, Belfast in UK. From one professor Deepak Padmanabhan, he is mentoring us towards this, and we got a lot of idea, especially in the health fake news. We got a good algorithms to come up with understanding the fakeness in that based on the emotional content. So what we did is we just amplify the emotional content in that news. Then definitely this gives us more informative and machine learning aspects of classifying the fake news and the genuine cases. So what we understood is that the emotional content is more there in the fake news, especially in the health fake news. And another point I just want to mention here is so we have a thought process of building a open source and open data source for health analytics, especially in the Kerala, the state of southern state of India. So we are trying to build a open consortia our university is the largest university in Kerala in terms of student enrollment. So we got 4 lakh students enrollment and around 450 colleges affiliated to our university. So we are trying to build a task force connecting students and researchers as a open consortia exclusively for the health analytics area. So definitely we need your support to come up with a project proposal to hand over to Government of Kerala in this baseline. Yeah.
Okay, I think we will talk it further. I will discuss it with your team, Dr. Tim, and I think the people at Geneva. Okay, you can continue, madam. And Jignesh is asking one question, I think.
I think it's really nice to hear about the plans for developing a consortium, and delighted to hear that you're really engaged with your fact checker community to support that. I think we can all help support our local fact checking community to be champions of truth. And certainly there are plans underway for some more support to roll out in the coming months to support the fact checker international network, I would say, is what we need to really build here. So we have the local fact-checking communities, we have the national, we have the regional, we have an international fact-checker community that can do, support in an ongoing basis to try and detect anything that's coming out as a harmful narrative, to be able to act quickly, which is also helpful for trying to detect new health threats as well, potentially. But then, we would have this great, strong community that can be quickly activated and all acting in concert, knowing where they need to go to get the right information, to quickly share that with networks when there's a health emergency. So there's that surge and fact checker activity, which is a really nice thing that we need to keep building and strengthening. On the comment that you made about understanding what's driving the viralization of some harmful messages, I would just say that I think the term fake news is problematical because it undermines a lot of the efforts of media that are actually, really focused on fact checking and providing, fair reporting on things. And sure, there are always, challenges and limitations there. But I think there's a difference between, mistakes or issues of balance that we're seeing, in particular news pieces versus what we're seeing differently in terms of malicious actors pushing disinformation campaigns through other channels. And so I think it's helpful for us to frame it as, how are we trying to counter harmful narratives just through any medium or platform or channel, online or offline, and how are we promoting access to the helpful information, right? So the fact checker network is fantastic. And then, also thinking about how do we create more of these connection points between communities and the public health authorities so that at an earlier stage, it's, there's this process of co-designing, and co-informing the public health measures as they're rolling out. And then, looking for those key influencers in communities who can then try and help disseminate this information through their networks is critical. And because we are in these social bubbles, finding those people who are little hub points, between different networks is also really critical. So we need to do more mapping of our communication ecosystem to figure out where are those hubs or bridges to different networks so that we can perhaps target information sharing there for more rapid dissemination of useful information. Over.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I will share an email address if there's any further questions or follow-up. And I'm so delighted to see this event and hear about the great work that you're doing and then hear about the great work that you're planning. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Richard Rigo is attending. Actually, any questions from anybody? So I think we will wind up now. I can over to Reshma.
Thank you, sir. It was actually a really informative session. And I would like to express our profound gratitude to all the resource persons and our beloved participants for being with us patiently all this time. And especially Sri Sunil Prabhakar sir for strongly supporting us. Thank you all. And a glance of tomorrow's program. We'll start sharply at 10 a.m. with the topic, what are the Google News initiatives in fighting against misinformation by Ms. Irene J. Liu, and Misinformation Spreading Through WhatsApp in India by Ms. Shruti Menon, Elements of Fact-Checking and Verification by Sri Pratik Sinha, and the last session will be Disinformation Spread in India During Pandemic by Dr. Issa Sanjeev. This will be followed by a panel discussion on Break the Fake, and we'll have the 150 session after that. Hope to meet you all tomorrow morning, sharp 10 a.m. Be with us. Have a nice evening. Thank you.